Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Mexican-American War, Part 2. So we're going to talk about 5 terms that as you read more about this topic and you learn more about this topic, it's good to key in on because this is a conflict with a lot of complexity. It's studied very differently in some cases, depending on where somebody might have grown up. So, these are a couple of basics that, it's good to know. So the first topic for us is something called the Bear Flag Revolt. Now, the Bear Flag Revolt happened in 1846, and it happened in will become modern California. And the Bear Flag Revolt has to do with a couple of individuals who will eventually identify as Americans, essentially attempting to stage a revolt against the presence and authority of the Mexican government that existed in what will become eventually California. Now, there will be some back and forth conflicts really throughout the state, and eventually there will be a treaty whereby the fighting in California will come to an end. The second term for us to be thinking about is something called the Battle of Buena Vista. This is also known as the Battle of La Angostura if you study the conflict in Mexico. And there's a few interesting things, I think, that it's good for us to know about this conflict. First off, just the fact that you have 2 different names tells us this is a conflict that is studied differently depending on whether or not you're in the US or whether or not you're necessarily in Mexico. Secondly, the thing I think that this tells us is this is a conflict that when the battle is eventually over, both sides kind of claimed victory. So the battle happens in February of 1847 over the course of 2 days, February 22nd and February 23rd. The Americans, you've got somewhere around 4,500 troops, a little bit more than that. And the Mexican army is about 15,000 troops. Both sides fight pretty hard here. The Mexican army is a fairly competent fighting, it's a very good fighting force here. And they, along with the Americans, take a number of casualties. But even though the Mexican army is quite larger than the Americans here, they pull back sort of towards the end here, and that kind of brings us to our few other aspects of the battle. One of which is that you have a number of accounts from the time period that write a bit about the privation that existed in the Mexican army. So for some of the average soldiers here, they were struggling a great deal in terms of an access to food, so supply line issues. The other thing is the battle is one of many that for the Americans, many of the young officers and junior officers in their army are going to be some of the big names for the Americans in the Civil War. So somebody like Jefferson Davis, right, who's involved in this battle, will eventually become the president of the Confederate States, so the other side. The third term for us is the Texas Rangers. Now, some folks may think of the Texas Rangers not at all. Some folks may think of the Texas Rangers as a baseball team. Some folks may think of the Texas Rangers from a Chuck Norris TV show. Some folks may think of the Texas Rangers from their role as law enforcement officers. In the 1840s, the national military for the US, of course, takes part in the war against Mexico. But there are also a number of what we today would call guard units or militia units that are essentially volunteer or recruited to basically go down into Mexico and to assist the US Army. And the Rangers are a part of that. Many of these volunteer units are not exactly noted for their discipline, in some cases are struggling with a lack of food, and especially when it comes to their engagement with the civilian population in Mexico, we should note that it's not exactly the greatest. And there are any number of cases of atrocities being committed by some of these forces against Mexican civilians. That there was a clearly racialized aspect of this. There's a clear aspect of assault that occurs here. This is often about race and power. It's very, 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 very difficult. All right. The fourth term for us is just Mexico City. So when the American military lands and arrives in Mexico, so they're going to land at Veracruz, they're going to send forces over land. They're going to divide their forces, and they're going to be relatively disciplined and smaller forces in combat. that are going to carry out a couple of different campaigns. And one of them in 1847 is they're going to try to capture Mexico City. And they will after taking Chapultepec. But I think one of the interesting things in the lead up to taking Chapultepec and in the aftermath of Chapultepec is a couple of things. So the Mexican army is a relatively, or has some, fairly diverse units that are fighting for it. One was called the St. Patrick's Battalion, which was kind of made up of expats and other immigrants really from all over the world, particularly from Ireland. And then there's another group of young men who are fighting for Mexico in the aftermath of Chapultepec, because the American army, after taking this, of course, is going to go to a number of different gates around the city and try to get through there. And you have a number of young men who are going to try to defend their city. The heroic cadets, or the heroic boys, the niños héroes, right? These young men who are killed, right? There's about a half dozen of them who are killed. There's a monument to them in Chapultepec Park now, which folks can see. The fifth term for us is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this is the treaty that brings an end to the war, and is one, I think, that for some living in the US today, studying this conflict, that we might not necessarily know all about. So for over $10 million, the United States, as a part of this treaty, right, sort of gets to claim victory, but they also get to acquire a number, or a fairly large amount of territory, functionally most of the southwestern United States, which is also, or was, 40% of the nation of Mexico, right, is acquired as a result of this particular treaty. All right. Thank you very much.